Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with Kasey Leander once more to talk about my conversation with Jerry Pattengale about the new Book of Christian Martyrs. Kasey, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Shane. Been a minute. Tim has stepped in my absence and knocked it out of the park as usual, but I love being here on Further Upstream, so thanks for having me back.
Sure thing. You and your bride have been traveling recently, right?
She gets the month of June essentially off. So she works at a college. There's no college students here, so we get to go see our families usually over the summer is how that works. And then I write breakpoints wherever we happen to be. So,
oh man, that's great. My family and I have been sick here, so my voice still sounds a little weird. I recorded an episode with Rosaria Butterfield a couple of days ago, and I didn't even say anything about my voice. So people are going to be wondering, who is this? Who is this guy with the nasally, like haggard sound? No, it's me after having been sick for like a week and a half.
Just double the baritone. That's all. You just double up on the baritone.
That's exactly what she said. She was like, oh, you have this kind of rich baritone. I think she said something about it being a little bit stuffy sounding, but
what can you do?
Our producer, Mark, in this case, is a wizard, and he can work all kinds of magic with it, make me sound good.
That's amazing that they can undo stuffiness now.
Oh yeah, they got filters for all that kind of stuff.
Wow. Using AI, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So on this conversation in particular, I was led to reflect on a lot of questions that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, Kasey. And one of the questions was how Christianity itself seems pre-baked with this expectation of martyrdom. Reading through the stories of this book, having the conversation with Dr. Pattengale, just highlighted for me how much from the very moment that the New Testament begins, when the book of Acts begins, right, with the stoning of Stephen, how even in the Gospels, Jesus tells his followers to expect persecution. And then there's this episode with Jesus going to the cross and all of his followers scattering, or most of his followers scattering, despite the fact that they had said they'd go with him to death, right? So right from the very beginning, you have this baked in expectation of martyrdom. And I want to reflect on that for a moment and just ask the question, why is it that Christianity is a martyr-centric religion? And how does that set it apart from others?
I thought that was fascinating too, Shane. As a side note, I actually know Dr. Pattengale.
Oh, great.
My parents are graduates of Azusa Pacific University, where he taught for a number of years. And so I've known Dr. Pattengale through the years and so respect his scholarship on that. But yeah, as I was listening to you guys' episode, I really had the same question, specifically with Islam. I don't know why, but to me, those two traditions, our two faiths, really do highlight martyrs, but the martyrdom they emphasize is so different, right? In Islam, there's this sense of like not backing down from trial or combat. I even looked up verses from the Quran and the Hadith, and they say things like, who is a martyr? A martyr is someone who dies fighting for Islam. A martyr is someone who dies defending his religion, or who's killed defending his family. So there's a very traditional sense of someone who's taken up arms and is in combat. They also have other traditions where martyr is anyone who dies in an epidemic, or dies from a stomach disease, or dies from drowning. So I'd love to hear an Islamic scholar break those down and what is specifically meant by that. But
I'd rather hear who isn't a martyr, given that list.
Right.
Because when you sent me the list and I got to severe stomach ache kills you, it's like, you are a martyr. Congratulations. If you drown, you're a martyr. It's like,
right.
Who doesn't qualify as a martyr at this point?
I mean, that's good news. Yeah. I have no idea. I'm such a novice when it comes to Islam. I would just love to hear someone break that down, right? But like, Christianity is so different. And I think you're right. It's baked in. I mean, the central act of Jesus is an act of martyrdom on earth. He came, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Yeah, there's that Christian difference. For Christians, a martyr is, or at least predominantly has been, someone who dies for their testimony. So in other words, it's the classic form of martyrdom that emerges when you read a book like this with just dozens and scores of accounts is somebody, usually an authority, usually a government figure, but sometimes it's a religious figure or a family member or something like that, says, you're a Christian, I don't like that fact, you need to recant your faith, or you need to become my kind of Christian, or something like that. And then the martyr says, no, I'm not going to, and you're going to have to kill me instead. And so they oblige them. And that's just kind of the form that emerges again and again. And one of the interesting things that does come out of that, I find in most of the accounts, it seems like there's a real opportunity given to escape death. And you can escape it through a seemingly trivial act. So the classic example in the early days of Christendom is give a pinch of incense to the emperor, right? So you have to acknowledge the emperor's divinity by just giving a little pinch of incense. And this is like, the early martyrs like Justin Martyr or Polycarp or Perpetua or someone like that. And there's this out that's offered them. And it doesn't seem like a big deal. I mean, you can go right back to your life, continue to be a Christian. It's not, you don't even have to stomp on an icon of Jesus or denounce his name or something like that. You just give a little pinch to the emperor. And that sort of thing recurs again and again. There's this, well, just renounce your teachings and say that the Pope is right, and we'll let you go. In examples leading up to the Reformation, where you've got Christian on Christian sort of martyrdom happening. And, I guess the stories wouldn't be preserved in the case of those who basically recanted and said, okay, all right, you got me. I'll back down and renounce my faith. But it seems like there's this eager willingness to say, no, I'm not going to do this token act that somehow sullies or denigrates or renounces my faith, because that is the central aspect of who I am, a servant of Christ, a servant of the truths about Christ, which I have believed through his word and through the preaching of the apostles. And if I do that, then I'm nothing. I'm renouncing the most important part about me.
Right. And you can see the Romans being so puzzled by that, because they were incredible syncretists. They conquer a new people and just add the gods to the pantheon. But as long as you give that pinch of incense to the emperor, you're good. Like, as long as they have a seat at the table with their, emperor worship. And so you can picture the confusion as Christians are just unwilling to do that. I came across a Dietrich Bonhoeffer quote, Shane, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, where he says, "The cross is laid on every Christian. The first Christ suffering, which every man must experience, is the call to abandon the attachments of this world. Thus it begins. The cross is not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life, but it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." So in a sense, to be a Christian is to sign up for a form of martyrdom at the front, right? And Jesus, it's amazing how often through the Gospels he says, don't start building a house unless you've counted the cost first, right? And so Jesus's call is take up your cross and follow me. It's the opposite of a prosperity gospel or a gospel of winning here on earth. It's the call to come and lose here on earth.
You almost wonder how you can be a Christian without martyrdom being a prospect over the course of your life, right? Because it seems so baked in. The expectation seems so ever present in the early days of the faith and in the founding of the faith with the apostles and the Acts and the early martyrs under Rome, that it's like, how do you process an era of Christian living and existence where martyrdom is not a constant threat? Even to this day, it's such a big deal, such a constant presence and reminder of Christ's words for so many Christians around the world. And in the West, it's not a realistic prospect. It could happen, but it's not something that hangs over our heads. And it makes you wonder, how it sounds prideful, I guess, but how are you going to enter the kingdom and sort of look people in the face who actually did have to lay down their lives for their faith and be like, I guess you're just going to go, oh, I'm a second-class citizen here, right? But for the blood of Jesus, this is not something I've ever had to experience. And thank God, but also, wow, it makes the whole thing seem different.
Right. And Shane, you and I deal with that tension a lot as we're thinking about how to frame Breakpoint articles. I think our whole team wrestles with that. On one hand, we have these examples of just extreme dedication, right? Like willingness to go unto death. And the reality that Jesus is like, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the people who are getting the crap kicked out of them for my sake, right? And it's like, okay, the losers are winners in a kingdom economy if they're losing for Christ's sake. On the other hand, you and I deal so often with essentially the wisdom principles of Scripture, where it's talking about, like, for example, principles of sexuality. If you're faithful to your spouse over the course of your whole life, if you work on your marriage, if you invest in it instead of doing the expressive individualist thing and finding a new chapter, right, with someone new, and when your spouse isn't really cutting it for you, it's like if you live that way, you're prone to thrive. You're prone to do better in life, right? Like, and statistically, that's just true. You're going to make more money. Your kids are going to turn out statistically, again, better. So there's a tension there where the principles of Christianity lead to, forgive me for this terminology, I hate it, but like, quote unquote, winning in the world, right? But the call of Jesus is actually to lose by the world's standards. How do you, as you're thinking about that tension, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing that immediately comes to mind, Kasey, is that the one to whom much is given is the one from whom God expects a great deal, right? Expects more. So here we are in this privileged position of not having to, we got freedom. We don't have the constant prospect of having to give our lives for our testimony about Christ. And we've got great resources at our disposal, both in terms of time and education, years of our lives, family resources, the ability to just get together and form a nonprofit and raise money and work toward a cause, right? The thing that we do every day for work. That's not something that Christians for a lot of history have enjoyed. And so instead of sitting around and doing the sort of thing that the proto-monastic communities of the early Middle Ages, after the persecutions under the Romans had ended, did, where they were like, oh, gosh darn it, there's no more persecution. No one wants to kill us for being Christians anymore. Well, I guess we're going to go out and sit on some piles of rocks in the wilderness and persecute ourselves so that we can suffer for the sake of Christ. And, then they got bored with that and they were like, it's lonely out here. What if we got together and sat on piles of rocks together? And then what if we brewed beer? And the next thing you know, the monasteries are born, right? It's
an amazing summary. You should write a book about that.
Take vows of chastity and poverty. Bit of an oversimplification, but that's the way I kind of learned it. It was very much born out of this desire, especially in the Celtic context, right? To experience a form of martyrdom without actually being martyred, when there was no one who wanted to do the killing or the martyring. So you don't want to run to that extreme and wish for persecution, because persecution's a bad thing. Persecution destroys much that God and his people, God loves and that his people should love, right? We want the church to prosper. We want the vision of the prophets to come true. We want every man to sit under his own tree and the nations to stream into the Mount Zion and worship God and bring their treasures and their praises, right? That's a vision of peace. We want the wolf and the lamb to lie down together and the child to play at the cobra's den. Those go far beyond natural import. They are metaphors that teach us of a time when Christ's reign will be all pervasive and his opponents will be silenced. And we have real foretastes of that in things like religious freedom and things like a nation whose laws justly protect the expression of Christian faith and other faiths, right? These are gifts we should appreciate. But backing up to what I said a second ago, as we acknowledge and receive these gifts, we have to feel the weight of that responsibility, because we're not subject to the demand that we either give up our lives or give up our faith. We now have the solemn responsibility before God to use that freedom, to use those resources, not on ourselves and our own pleasures and delights, but on the service of God's people and his kingdom. What does that look like? Well, there's a lot of answers to that question. I think part of it will look like what the Apostle Paul said we should desire: to live a quiet and humble life, to work with our hands, and to serve the Lord in everything that we're called to do, however mundane those tasks are, right? And then to build his church and to worship him. That's the work of the people of God on a basic level. But that also means that we are uniquely situated to fund, to participate in, and to push forward missions, right? We're better positioned than anyone in the history of the world, essentially, to be evangelists. And the United States in particular has this proud history of sending out missionaries. I mean, much of the Christianization around the world has been a result of missions movements from the United States. And that's all a result of that freedom that we've got. So I'm not saying we've like knocked it out of the park or anything, but I am saying that because of the gifts we've been given, we have a great responsibility. And that may be the thing that all the martyrs and Christ himself are looking to us and going, let's see it. You got the stuff. Now let's see the goods.
But I think you're right that there's something off-putting about like someone who's just seeking martyrdom for martyrdom's sake. It's like, come on, man. Like, yeah, I don't know. Christianity is not asceticism.
Well, have you ever seen those guys in the Philippines? I don't want to pick on anyone in particular here, but these are Filipino Catholics, and the Catholic Church has actually denounced this. They've said, "Don't do this. This is bad," right? But they will do these Passover and Easter processions where they'll go through the streets and they actually self-flagellate. So they whip themselves with these kind of sharp braided whips, and they're actually bloodying their backs and stuff. And it's a reenactment of Jesus, passion. And then at some point, a couple of the guys will actually have people nail them to crosses with these really tiny nails.
Oh my gosh.
But they're actually nailing them through their hands and stuff. It's wild. But that's the sort of impulse that I guess the extreme form of the impulse we're talking about, to martyr yourself.
There's a human impulse there. I mean, look at some of the Eastern religions like Buddhism. I mean, if you want asceticism, that's your religion, right? I mean, they're very, very good at it. Even in Vietnam, there were the different monks who would like self-immolate, right, to protest the war. And you have to admire the courage of that, just the raw guts that would take. But Christianity is so much more. It's actually, I think as you were talking to me, it just is boiled down to our purpose on earth, right? It's an extreme dedication to Christ and his kingdom. And if that includes martyrdom, then that's our great joy to step up to the plate. But even if it doesn't, we're supposed to live as though we've sold everything and we've bought the field where there's treasure buried, right? And I'm thinking of two examples, Shane, from my life, and I'd love to hear if you have some from yours. One is a very dear friend of mine who has wrestled with same-sex attraction his whole life. He has a ministry sort of centered around questions of sexuality and a pastoral ministry. And he's very open about this story, right? But his call then, as far as he knows, is probably to be single and celibate his whole life, And so now, part of me, when I was single, I thought, okay, if this guy is out here living this way, it's just extra incentive for me to live according to Christian sexual ethics. You know what I mean? Like the call to come and die for my friend looks a certain way. But even his example encouraged me to say, okay, I have a call to come and die to something that the rest of culture would be like, you're fine. Like you're fine no matter what your orientation is. Like go for it. It's like, but Jesus calls us to something higher. And so now that I'm married, still I don't want to lose that edge. And I want to think of how we structure church to be a place of family and community and inclusivity for people who have that specific calling on their life, a calling to celibacy. The other example is just some of my wife and my dear friends who live in Phoenix. He works in an urgent care in an underprivileged part of that city, and he's constantly just seeing people straight off the streets with they need urgent medical attention. And then on top of that, they do foster care, which I have so much respect for people who step in. There's such a need right there. It's like, but they're not doing anything. I mean, they are doing something heroic, but it's not like they're not volunteering for overseas missions necessarily. In their context, there's like steps of faithfulness that they're taking that when you see it up close in people who are really surrendered to that kingdom vision, I don't know, to me, that's where my mind goes. But I don't know, do you have any examples like that?
Yeah, for me, my mind immediately goes to the parents and caretakers of people with profound disabilities. So one of the things, and everybody I know who does this, partly because I am a Christian and partly, those are my social circles, but also partly because I think Christianity offers something special to such people in such situations. They're Christians, right? And they're motivated very explicitly by their Christianity. So I think of a former colleague who has a a son who's, I guess, my age or possibly a little bit older, who has autism, and he's been together with his mother. He has been the primary caregiver for him for his whole life, and he's working on how to set him up long term because my friend's not going to be around forever to take care of him. Right. This is the story with Chuck Colson's grandson, Max. His mom, Emily, has just dedicated herself tirelessly to being there for her son, to loving him, I guess, bearing witness to the love and message of Christ in his life, and then encouraging him to do the same. And he's done exactly that in his unique way, and it's beautiful. And then my a relative of mine, actually, she had a son with cerebral palsy who passed away a number of years ago after he was over 25 years old when he died. And then another son with autism who's still with us. And just, spending time with her, living with her for brief intervals, visiting, and just seeing first of all, the work. I mean, my goodness, the amount of work she puts in. And then the sense that I'm here for these boys, and now this boy, forever. As long as I'm here for him. And there's just nothing that could call me away. And she doesn't have any sort of expectations or hopes beyond that. And it's all about her Christianity and her church. And her church has come through beautifully for her as well in that way. And it's like the motivation there to lay down your life for another is just Christian motivation in all three of those contexts that I named. It's just Christ working through these parents, right? And I don't know how exactly to explain the perseverance that I see there, but there is an element of, I guess we could cautiously call it martyrdom. There is a laying down of yourself, right? A taking up of a cross. And you could look at it and go, well, in some sense, it's obligatory. But look, I mean, you don't have to scour the world to find horrible stories of people who have kind of just abandoned those in need, even those of their own flesh and blood. When you see someone willing to make those kinds of sacrifices cheerfully and lovingly, it's inspiring. It's humbling. And I don't know what else to make of it, but a kind of laying down of your life in obedience to the commands of Christ.
And that's where the joy is found too. We write on Christians who are caring for the elderly. I just wrote one on Cicely Saunders, who invented modern hospice care. It was her privilege and delight to care for people in their last moments. And one of her best lines is, "We're not just going to be with you until you die. We're going to help you live until you die." Right? I mean, just beautiful. And I think my suspicion is you talk to any Christian who's in that. I mean, Emily Colson being an amazing example. They're not going to sugarcoat how hard it is sometimes, but they're just going to say, this is what we're supposed to do. This is why we're on this earth, is to sacrifice and love and care for people. And more than that, Shane, when we don't do that, when people don't do that, when they turn inwards, you see how miserable it makes us, right? In a sense, the martyrdom of Christianity is both radical and extreme, but it's also just a reorienting of our hearts towards what they should naturally be oriented towards in a world created by God. God is selfless and giving. And so we should be selfless and giving. And that actually generates the life that we're looking for.
Yeah, amen.
I wanted to ask, when you read this book by Dr. Pattengale, what were some of the stories that stood out to you? Help me, as someone who hasn't read it yet, want to read it.
Okay. So I picked 3 stories that sort of span the time spectrum from the early church, so the year 303, into the 1400s, and then just a few years ago. So one that stood out to me that I had never read about before, maybe I'd heard her name, but I'd never actually read the story, was Eulalia, right? So it's this 13-year-old in Spain who's killed under Diocletian. And the reason she is killed is because during this persecution, she marches into town, essentially. She goes, I'm tired of seeing Christians die. She marches into town bursts into like the chambers of the city officials and gives this impassioned speech about how she's a Christian, and she's 13 now. Okay. How she's a Christian, and she's witnessing her Christian brothers and sisters being killed by the emperor and his cronies and his co-emperor at this time, right? And she specifically insults the co-emperor, who, I don't quote me on this, but I think I'm remembering from history that this co-emperor was like Diocletian's lover. Okay. So they're his like gay lover, right? But they're both in cahoots, persecuting the Christians. She comes in and she says, I'm not going to stand for this anymore. And they're like, well, we're going to kill you. And she's like, go ahead. That's fine. Well, it'll be really hard for you, I'm sure, given that I'm this, petite 13-year-old girl. And she's actually mocking them, according to this account. She's actually mocking them in their, how big and tough you are. You're going to kill this girl, right? And so they torture her to death. And she's got this, and they're like, well, okay, you can, and it's just like the stories that I told earlier. You can give the pinch of incense, right? You can do the thing. Look, you're pretty, you're young, you're stupid, obviously. You got yourself into this. You got a big future ahead of you. You could probably get to, be some patrician's wife or whatever. Just do the incense thing, right? Just get out of here, kid. And she doesn't do it, right? She said, I'm going to die for my faith. And so they kill her.
Wow. So
that was one story of just the sense of overwhelming, unhesitating boldness about, her testimony and her defense of other Christians. So that's one. The other one is well known to just about any Protestant, right? This is part of Protestant mythology, but it's true. It's Jan Hus, right? Or Huss, some people say. 1400s, early 1400s. He's considered kind of this proto-reformer. So the story is that we know the facts, and then we know some of the cool, like almost prophetic legends around it, where his name means goose, right? And he said, you can cook this goose, but in a century, God's going to send a swan and you won't be able to stop him, right? His song will be too powerful and too difficult for you to contain. And that becomes Martin Luther, right? Who allegedly part of his crest, his family crest, was a swan. So Huss lives during this time of the Proto-Reformation, where there are actually three popes fighting over who's going to be pope. He's led away from the Roman Catholic Church by his study of Scripture in the process of trying to become a priest, and then he just becomes this regional preacher in Bohemia, who's leading people as best I can tell, Kasey, to what I would consider a pure form of the gospel. Right? He's teaching people that you're justified by belief in Jesus, trusting in Jesus, not by this system that you've been set up with, right? And obviously, we're into internecine Christian stuff here, right? But yeah, I would look back on him and consider him this holy martyr for the faith. And he is burned brutally for his faith. And he does that same kind of thing where he goes down with a song. He goes down, cheerfully, according to the stories. And so that's a really inspiring one, that just even the fact that they incinerate his body and like sprinkle his ashes into the river, and they're hoping the memory of this guy will be extinguished. Well, sorry. It wasn't extinguished. It
doesn't work that way.
Inspires generations, henceforth.
Man, we need these stories, Shane.
Yeah. Okay. So there's one more. One more, and you know it too. And this is the one that really just, I guess, in the modern era stands out because of the number, and then the public nature of it, and then because of how iconic it became, and because it's in living memory. Like, I remember seeing this. I remember watching this. And that was the 21 Coptic martyrs in Libya on the beach, where they're marched out by their ISIS captors in those orange jumpsuits, and simultaneously all 21 of their heads are cut off, right? And what emerges about these guys afterwards is these are not priests. These are not trained theological figures. They're not clergy. They're not anything that you would consider kind of deep in the church. These are migrant workers, essentially. It's what they are. They're Egyptian Christians. One was from another country, and he was actually converted by them after that captivity, and essentially decides to die with them. So that's number 21. But the composure and the courage and the obvious just calm in the face of death that was displayed there, and then the way ISIS propaganda video gets completely turned on its head and becomes this testimony to the world of the virtue and certainty of Christian faith. I think it will go down in history. I think it deserves to be in a book like this because people are going to remember that. Because what a defeat for that violent and hateful sect. And what a victory for this very, very ancient, by the way, Christian group and the testimony of their faith. I mean, what they gave their lives for there. And it was so explicit too. It wasn't like they were drag kicking and screaming. It was like, we have chosen to be here because of Jesus. And they actually all sit, according to this account, and I don't remember this, but this was remarkable. According to Pattengale's account and Johnny Moore's, they actually sang like one line of a hymn as their heads were chopped off. And it was basically "My Lord Jesus" is kind of what they were singing.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that one stands out of my mind as like a great capstone on the whole history of martyrdom in this book. But yeah, there's so many stories like that, and just details that reinforce these recurring themes that we've talked about here.
It's so powerful. I mean, even as you're telling these stories, I'm like, well, my book's already coming. It's in the mail, but it's we need this, Shane. We're so many Christians, I imagine, who listen to, your podcast and they're listening to this cultural commentary. I mean, we just feel the decadence of the West, and we just feel like we're locked in this culture war that's not going well. And there's like I feel many days sort of a fruitless anger towards how poorly culture is doing everything, and in some ways that's my daily thing. I just got to bring that to the Lord and be like, God, give me love for my fellow human beings again today. And let me have you carry this burden for me, and let me think carefully and truthfully. But like stories like this help me do that. It's just a reminder, like, this is what it's all about. It's about being faithful to King Jesus, who did not come the first time to bring judgment, but to offer hope of reconciliation. And so that's why we should be willing to be martyred, is because Jesus is holding out the olive branch to humanity, and he's not fighting back. No one takes his life. He gives it up freely. And when you watch Christians actually do that, it's the most powerful thing in the world, right? And it just, to me, it reframes so much of how my attitude and my strategy should be towards the culture. We're not here to bludgeon people into the kingdom. We're here to be a living sacrifice, if anything, and to speak the truth always, and to be witty and to be winsome and to be compelling in our logic. But at the end of the day, the calling is, like Bonhoeffer said, it's to come and die. And I want to be willing to do that in whatever way the Lord calls me to do it, right?
And the reason that has such power, Kasey, is because Satan's final weapon is death. Satan is the one who holds the power of death, right? And that's his weapon of fear. In the very beginning of Tom Holland's book Dominion, which I have talked about so much on the podcast because it really opened some doors for me intellectually.
This podcast brought to you by Dominion by Tom Holland.
Right. He would be, thank you so much. There's an opening, I guess, vignette he does in that book where he talks about the horror of the Roman cross and the way crucifixion was this weapon of gut-gnawing terror for the subjugated peoples in their empire, and how that was the final symbol. That was the thing that proved it doesn't matter what you think, what you believe, how bad you want to be free or out from under the dominion of Rome. At the end of the day, those crosses are the final answer, because you will end up on one. So make your choice, subjugated person. You can either bow to Caesar or you can suffer that fate. And that kept everyone in line because there was no alternative. And then along comes this Jewish peasant, essentially, gets himself nailed to a cross. And within a very short time, the cross is raised over the Roman Empire as a symbol of hope, new life, resurrection, and victory over death. Why? What on earth could have happened to change that symbol of martyrdom and torture and subjugation into a symbol of those things, of the victory of the dominion, we could put it this way, of Christianity? That's because the man who died on it was so remarkable. and because his followers ardently believed he rose from the dead, which of course he did. But Tom Holland puts it, in skeptical terms. And that cross symbolized the destruction of Satan's great weapon of death. Jesus said, "Fear not him who can kill the body, but he who can cast both body and soul into hell," right? He's like, fear God, don't fear men, because all men can do is kill your body. What's the line in the last verse of "A Mighty Fortress is Our God"? The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. And that's just a statement, a gloating over the defeat of Satan and his power of death. He's got nothing on us. He can't destroy us because all he can do is kill the body. But we know one who can raise our bodies. And so it's like an absolute mockery of him. And I think that's the source, if I'm guessing from my safe little perch here in 21st century America, I think looking back over the stories of the martyrs of all these centuries, I think that's the source of their defiance and even their joy and the kind of the attitude that gives them a song in the midst of the flames, is because they know who wins. They know that his victory will become their victory and that death means nothing in the end, because they know the man who escaped death and who will bring them out of it as well. So I think that's the power of martyrdom. That's the testimony. And that's what must just frustrate the daylights out of the forces of darkness as they try again and again and again and fail.
That's awesome, man. And it's invincible. Yep. Everything you said. And to me, it's like, it just sharpens my vision of like what I want to be here on earth. You know what I mean? It's terrifying, but it's actually deeply hopeful. Who would have thought that like discussing martyrs like this actually would produce so much joy and hope?
Absolutely.
In the people who listen. So, I mean, that's just part of the victory of Christ.
Well, Kasey, thanks so much for joining me. This was a good conversation. Folks, the book, again, is by Johnny Moore, Jerry Pattengale. It's called The New Book of Christian Martyrs, the heroes of our faith from the first century to the 21st century. And it's just a great resource, highly accessible, easily readable, and just something to kind of work through with your family, I think, to help them understand the scope of what we're talking about here when we speak of Christian martyrs. Thanks for joining me, Kasey.
Thanks for having me, Shane. So good.